My name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Stephanie Tung from the Peabody Essex Museum. Stephanie serves as the Byrne family curator of photography, and she's here today to inform us about the very engaging and thought-provoking exhibition entitled As We Rise, Photography from the Black Atlantic, which is on display until December 31st. During the program, we'll find out why and how the exhibition came about, what the Black Atlantic encompasses. We'll go on a behind-the-scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate the wide range of experiences of Black life through the lenses of community, identity, and power. Let's start by meeting Stephanie and then hearing all about As We Rise, Photography from the Black Atlantic. Welcome, Stephanie. So delighted you're able to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to spend this day with you. Thanks, Jay.
Well, I had equally a wonderful time visiting the exhibition just a few days ago. Learned a lot, eager to find out more and have you inform viewers. Before we segue to that, I also think it would be of interest if you'd please share just a little bit about your background and what your current position entails.
Sure. My name is Stephanie Tung. I'm the Byrne family curator of photography at PEM. I've been at PEM for about 5 years and I've been in this position for about a year. And I'm a historian of photography. I study photography from 19th century to present. I have an academic background in photography from Asia. But this has been, working with the PEM collection has been incredible because it is a really rich collection that I think has been really sort of overlooked over the years. And so part of my job is to present and sort of interpret this collection, but then also think about bringing in new shows and thinking about what our audiences might be happy and really want to see. And so Aperture's As We Rise is one of these examples of a show that was brought in. It was organized by Aperture and curated by Elliot Ramsey. And so when I first saw the book, I was like, we really should bring this over.
What attracted you to the exhibition and thought it would be, which it most indeed is, a great fit for the Peabody Essex?
I mean, I think this is a show that is drawn primarily from the collection of Dr. Kenneth Montague, who is a Jamaican-Canadian collector. And he originated the Wedge collection in 1997, which was dedicated to championing artists of Black descent. And so when I saw the images, the works are incredible when I saw them in the book. And then thinking about the sort of mix of photographers, we have some iconic photographers, but also emerging photographers, things that we haven't really been able to see. And this is the only stop in the United States for this collection. And so that was one of the reasons why I really pushed to have it and actually think a little bit more about I think a collection that we've never seen in this part of the States before.
How about the title of the exhibition? What's some of its significance and I think very useful background to inform viewers before they see the collection?
Sure. So the exhibition itself started off as a book project published by Aperture. And I think the whole project has always been centered around this Wedge collection created by Dr. Kenneth Montague. And he was looking for images of Black life that could reflect who he was and aspired to be. And so I think that was really something that drove him when he started the collection in 1997. He was inspired actually as a 10-year-old, by this photograph by James Van Der Zee of a Harlem couple in raccoon coats. And it was something that was left such an impression that was of a sort of figure of Black life that was just so sort of aspirational and sort of dignified, which was not something that he was seeing very much in the media at the time. And so that was the sort of origins of this collection, why he wanted to start building it in 1990s. And as we started to think about this project, I think the Aperture team really was thinking, what sort of encapsulates that feeling. And I think in discussions, it turned out that as we rise, or the notion of lifting as we rise, was a motto, a sort of family motto that the Montagues had. It was something that Kenneth's father, an educator, would always say to his family: as we rise, we lift our community with us. And so that's the sort of sentiment, I think, that sort of runs through both the collection and the show. This notion that when we are, this notion of expanded family beyond just your blood relatives, that I think is sort of building this collection to give inspiration for others, especially younger generations.
And the exhibition highlights work beyond the United States. So the tie-in to the Black Atlantic. Would you just say a couple words about that?
Sure. So the title is As We Rise, Photography from the Black Atlantic. And it sort of points to, I think, this expanded notion of Black creativity and consciousness. It points to the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, but also thinks about the ways in which that legacy has created these shared cultures, histories, and identities, which allow us to think about the connections between different diaspora communities, even though there's different languages and histories, that there might be still sort of connections. And so I think this notion of connection and expanded family and migration is all sort of interwoven with this notion of the Black Atlantic. And so I think that's just to sort of give you a sense of it, I think there are about more than 100 works by 75 artists, and each of the artists has maybe one or two works. And they come from places in the US, Canada, the Caribbean, as well as South America, throughout Africa and Europe. So it really is encompassing all of these places that are peripheral to the Atlantic Ocean.
Before we enjoy some wonderful images from the exhibition, would you please lay out for the viewers who haven't had the opportunity to visit yet, just how the exhibition's organized, the different sections, the themes that are assembled?
Sure. So I think it's really interesting. This is a touring exhibition. It started out its life, as I said, as a book project. And so as a book project, it was very straightforward. There was a chapter on community, a chapter on identity, and a chapter on power. And these are the overarching themes. They're not sort of the only lens with which you could see these photographs, but more like three sides of a prism. And so you could sort of see any of the photographs in any of these sections, but you have to have some sort of sequential structure in a book. And so there are these chapters, and these photographs sort of fell into these groups. I think as I was working with Elliot Ramsey, who's the organizing curator, it sort of changed, I think, in each of the sort of locations where this exhibit actually was on view. It debuted at the University Art Museum in Toronto, and then it went to the Polygon Gallery in Vancouver, and we're the third stop and the only one in the US. And so I think with working with Elliot, it was really interesting. We wanted to think about ways in which there is a permeability in the sort of sections, so that it didn't feel like there's community or identity or power were sort of closed off. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the things that we really thought a lot about, how to keep that sense of permeability. I think at PEM specifically, we sort of settled on this idea of having the metaphor of a song. And so there's this sort of undercurrent of music and musical metaphors that are helping us guide us through the show, because it is sort of like a circle. And so we start with themes and variations of themes rather than sections. And we see community, and then we have community as expanded family and belonging, and then as care. And so this helps us sort of think about community, identity, power as themes, and then having these variations and having a break and a coda at the end. So it has this sort of structure that's musical that helps us guide us through.
And not that we're going to go into it right now, but there's a wonderful accompanying playlist that people can enjoy both partly during and definitely afterwards as well. But for the sake of time, let's begin our tour and start out with sort of the signature photograph for the exhibition, the one that we see right here. A few words about the photographer and its significance as part of the exhibition, please.
Sure. DeWitt Petros is a Canadian Eritrean photographer. And he emigrated from Eritrea to Canada as a young man. And I think this is something, I think his family settled in Saskatchewan, Canada. And I think it really encapsulates the show because he went, as a photographer, he went back to this community and started photographing others in the Canadian Eritrean community. So here we see the Hadenbees family. And the way that he's chosen to portray them is just so sort of dignified, and it looks to be like in their backyard, but it is this sense of togetherness that is like sort of like, and the parents are framing the photo. And so I think there's this sense of like migration, but also portrayal and portraiture that really is something that the collection itself tries to encapsulate. Almost all the photographs are portraits of Black subjects by Black photographers.
Let's continue with this one, Best Friends.
Sure. Jabal Shabazz is a photographer who's based in New York. And this is from the section Community as Expanded Family. And here we're talking about that notion again of how there's community can be something that's just not only your blood relatives, but like your neighborhood, the people that you care for at large. And Jamal was a photographer who was a veteran who came back to New York and was really noticing a lot of the changes in his community. And so he set it out to photograph his community. And I think there's always a sense of collaboration in the way that he's making these photographs. People are dressed in their best, posing in the way that they wish to be seen. And I think that sort of encapsulates this idea of caring and sort of engaging with the community in a collaborative manner.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wonderful shot here. A few words about the subject, the photographer.
Sure. Kennedy Carter is a young photographer, emerging photographer. And I think this is in our community as care section, and it really sort of shows, I think Kennedy is here pictured at the very beginning of COVID. This is a moment in which everybody's at home, like not going out, certainly not getting haircuts. And so she is posing here for a self-portrait with her father who's giving her a haircut. And I just love the way that she's like the light and the way that she's looking directly at the camera. And I think it really we wanted to put this at the beginning of the community as care section because it sort of highlights that notion of these tender gestures of caring for each other that actually help foster and cultivate the sense of community.
Yeah, no, I know we just touched on a few, but really appreciate the number of variations that are built into the broad themes of the exhibition. Just expanded my thinking of those notions quite a bit by having them to think about and make the connection to the different photographs, which, as you said, could rather easily have fallen under different parts of themes as well. Let's continue the tour, please.
Jun Lee. Jun Lee is a photographer who is an American photographer who is really interested in notions of fatherhood. And so he had a whole sort of series about really trying to understand father figures and sort of portray Black masculinity in a very different way, this sort of tenderness. And I think it was really interesting that he, I think, does not really work in a way that's just, he really develops relationships with these families. And so I think that's something that he's kept throughout this series of father figures. And yeah, this just the way that like the light above his head, the way that the sun is looking just off in the camera and he's looking at the camera. It's a beautiful portrait, and really gets again at that notion of care.
Most definitely, most definitely. Who do we see here?
This is Samuel Faso. So this is, I think we are moving here into the notions of identity. And so identity is the second of the major themes. And then I think there are a couple variations here. This one I think is in the identity as declaration sort of variation. And so we're thinking about portraiture and here specifically self-portraiture. Samuel Faso is a young photographer from the Central African Republic and who has a studio in Bangui. And I love it because he started as a very young man, about 13 or 14, as a studio assistant. And at the end of the day, he would have these extra negatives on the rolls of film. And so he got into the practice of making self-portraits every day just to sort of show, and he would send them back to his grandmother to say, like, I'm okay, like, you know, here I am, just to sort of announce his presence. But because of this practice, it soon became very experimental. He would dress up and sometimes in Western cowboy outfits. Here you have like the sort of high heels, disco sort of like very groovy shoes. And so it became a way of thinking and experimenting with fashion, sexuality, and gender that still he continues to this day.
And the next one is also in the identity area, Drum Cover Girl.
Sure. I think this is in identity as self-fashioning. And so it kind of gets into the same idea about in terms of style. James Byrne is a Ghanaian photographer. And I think he was really important because he began photographing in London. He migrated to London and began photographing there in the 1960s. And he was an early photojournalist. So I think it's very different compared to Samuel Faso's. Samuel Faso's was much more about sort of self-portraiture. This one is about looking outward into the community. And so he was finding people and photographing people on the streets of London. And so here, you see Erlyn Ibrecht, who is a model who became the cover model of Drum magazine in South Africa. And I think it was really important because she's wearing this incredible Pucci dress. She has this jewelry. She has this like stare about her and the way that she's holding her necklace, which is actually really sort of like declarative, which I really love. But I think contextually, it was also really important because Byrne was photographing for Drum Cover at a time when it was being published in South Africa. And this was not like a sort of representation of it was a rare representation of a Black cosmopolitan sort of fashionable woman in South Africa at that time.
Mm-hmm. You know, before we continue the tour with the photographs, another wonderful feature that enhances and extends the exhibition are several video sort of kiosks highlighting different Greater Boston community members. Again, wonderful tie-in to the overall theme of community. Just a few words about who's highlighted and the intent of those videos, please.
Sure. I think that one of the things that we really wanted to think about was, what does this mean for our community here in the Greater Boston region? There's these incredible themes that have been sort of popping up, such as community as care, identity as self-fashioning, joy and groove. And I think this is something that resonates. I really love that word of resonating because it gets to that musical theme, but also kind of like a way in which we can sort of identify and find something that's familiar. And so I think what we decided to do was to look and sort of highlight or spotlight people in our community who are already doing work that was related to what was in the show. So at the end of the community as care section, for example, we have a little sort of 3-minute video profile of Nicole McLean from Lynn, Massachusetts. And she is a community organizer. She's a veteran. She's also the councilwoman at large of Lynn, Massachusetts. She is the founder of North Shore Juneteenth Association. And so she's been doing a lot of work to highlight Juneteenth history, and also I think prominent Black figures both locally and sort of nationally within the sort of North Shore community. And so we highlighted her 5K race project in Lynn, which was really cool because it was a way for us to say, like, you know, this is already happening. There was a 5K race that her organization organized with about more than 200 people, where they would be running through Lynn and see these figures, historical figures of Black excellence, and also local figures of Black excellence that really sort of jives with the sort of idea of the show of having these sort of positive images and role models highlighted. So yeah, I think that was a really nice way to think about community as care through a very local lens. I think the other figures that we have are Zainab Sumu, who is a fashion designer located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And she takes a lot of photographs and West African designs, architecture, and motifs, and sort of brings them together in her sort of designs for clothing and also sort of home. And then the third is Greg Coles, who is a dance instructor from Salem, Massachusetts. He runs a studio Foley and has a sort of a rotating schedule of classes that are really meant to sort of think about or introduce ideas of African rhythm and dance. And that sort of jives with the idea of joy and groove.
They're all very charismatic, and I think you wish the videos were even longer, but definitely serve the purpose and convey the meaning of the exhibition and their tie-in. Let's continue the photographs and touch on some for the other theme of power, I believe.
Sure. So as we move through the exhibition, I think there is a sort of break, like we could think about it as like an instrumental break or guitar break. And that's kind of like a section called Refusal. And I think that was really important for us to have in there because it was signaling about how, or trying to talk really about how the camera historically has been used for surveillance and control, especially for people of color. And so in that sense, having the agency and control to sort of turn away from the camera to actually sort of not be subject to that gaze is also something that is really important. So in there, we have a couple photographs that are about blurs and motion and sort of concealing. This Liz Johnson Arthur photograph, I think, is also really kind of works in it because there's this sort of, we're not really sure what her expression is. We don't know where she is. We don't really know what she's thinking, but that sort of sideways glance, I think, is a sort of way of thinking, is also sort of related to this notion of refusal or sort of like not staying still for the camera, which I thought was really beautiful.
And this is another interesting one by photographer herself here.
Yeah. So I think as we move into the power sort of thematics, other sort of ideas that we're thinking about are reclaiming the camera, restoring the camera, ideas of rest and leisure. And so Lebohang Kanye is a South African photographer in the sort of thematic variation of power as a form of restoration. I think a lot of photography has often been used to sort of define and sort of create these very specific narratives. But I think there's also a way in which photographers now, contemporary photographers especially, are also really thinking about the camera as a way to restore narratives. And so in this one, you're seeing Lebohang Kanye. She went through her family archives and found photographs of her mother, who is the more solid figure on the left. And then she found the clothing that her mother had as hand-me-downs and sort of reworked them for herself and photographed herself superimposed next to her mother. So she's almost kind of like a shadow. And I think it's really beautiful because it sort of thinks about that dialogue. There are these histories that are unspoken, especially in South Africa, where there's an apartheid. And so I think this is a way in which the artist is trying to imagine these sort of dialogues by inhabiting the clothing, but also the place and time that her mother was, and trying to create those sort of conversations.
Now, it really works well on several occasions. And a couple words about this one and some of the interesting backstory that it has.
Sure. DeWitt Petros, again, Eritrean Canadian photographer. And I think this one became really iconic as a photograph or signature photograph for the Wedge collection. Kenneth talks about how the man with the parka, like in the coldness, that sort of like represents Canada in some way. And then the sort of the sign. I think that this is a photograph that is very enigmatic, and I think like many different people have different sort of notions of what that sign, that sort of hand gesture could be. I think there is like what's it called, a precedent for it. This photographer was actually riffing off of historical examples of a work by Albert Dürer. And so this is a sort of take on that sort of historical painting of a sort of Christ figure making this sign. And so this sign could be something that could be interpreted as a sign or gesture of benevolence, but other people might think of it as something that's mysterious or a gang sign. And so it really sort of reflects on like what, that there's no answer. It reflects on what the viewer actually is thinking or projecting onto the image itself.
What's been some of the reaction and feedback you've gotten or observed from people who've had the opportunity to visit the exhibition?
I think people, so far, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. I think people have really thought it's refreshing to see a lot of these photographs, and also to see these photographs in a way in which it's, I think they're both the mix of both iconic and emerging photographers. There's something for everyone to see. And I think there's ways in which people can sort of connect that again, that sort of notion of resonance that I think has been really sort of beautifully highlighted. And I think that people kind of have really been resonating with it. So I think it's been overwhelmingly positive.
Another, just a very short word about the book that accompanies the exhibition.
Yeah, so this is the actual book. It came out last year. It was the start of the whole project, the As We Rise project. Aperture is primarily a publisher. And so I think this was, I think when they approached Kenneth about doing this, they had really thought about it as in its book format. And so we really took this book as the inspiration. Many of the labels and the quotes and the annotations are by prominent Black writers and curators who have all contributed to this book. And so it really is the sort of binding theme, or the theme that sort of carries the show itself.
Mm-hmm. And another wonderful sort of feature of the overall exhibition is the encouragement at the end to be guided by a few prompts and think about different ways community in various variations impact yourself, and to take a few minutes to jot down an idea and to share it on a panel there. Wonderful way to put an end to fantastic experience from viewing. Well, Stephanie, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the program. I want to thank you again for taking the time to be here. Really wonderful opportunity, well on into the fall, into the winter, December 31st. So quite a long stay for people to visit and enjoy and learn from the exhibition. Continued success with both this and future endeavors.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us, and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.